Just how common is common sense? Where in the world did this frequently used phrase come from? Answers to these questions and ever so much more, straight ahead. Stephen Carter here, your host for History of Everyday Sayings. I thank you for joining me. Who is this show for? If you are a logophile, a philomath, or you simply love history tidbits you can use to impress friends and family, you are in the right place. Common sense. Common sense. We hear that term almost daily, but how old is it? Where did it come from? And just how common is common sense? For a definition, let's go to Merriam-Webster, merriam-webster.com. Definition of common sense, quote, sound and prudent judgment based on a simple perception of the situation or facts. And that is the definition, very short and to the point. When we enter the search term, how common is common sense? We get a variety of opinions, points of view. One I find interesting is by Jim Taylor, who is a PhD. I'm assuming he's a psychologist. And his post in psychologytoday.com on July 12th, 2011, so this goes back a day or two. His take, quote, common sense defined as sound judgment derived from experience rather than study is one of the most revered qualities in America. It evokes images of early and simpler times in which industrious men and women built out our country into what it is today. People with common sense are seen as reasonable, down to earth, reliable, and practical. But, he adds, here's the catch. Common sense is neither common nor sense. There's not a whole lot of sound judgment going on these days, though whether it is worse than in the past, I can't be sure. So it's not common. If common sense was common, then most people wouldn't make the kinds of decisions they do every day. People would not buy stuff they can't afford. They wouldn't smoke cigarettes or eat junk food. They wouldn't gamble. And if you want to get really specific and timely, politicians wouldn't be tweeting pictures of their certain things to strangers. Certain things are my term. People wouldn't do the multitude of things that are clearly not good for them. And he goes on with other examples. So what about the history of the term common sense? How far does it go back in language or in use? Well, let's go to phrases.org.uk. And this is one of my most trusted references. This site tells us, quote, good practical sense, the natural intelligence that is believed to be available to all rational people. What's the origin of the phrase common sense? Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense in January 1776. It called for America to become independent of Britain, and a copy of the original is considered a treasure of the U.S. Library of Congress, being one of the wellsprings of the thinking that founded the country. Common sense, that is, a plain, practical, get on with the job philosophy, is part of the American psyche. Many people believe Paine was a native born on what is now American soil, but in fact he immigrated to colonial America after living the majority of his life in the English country town of Thetford, Norfolk. Despite his radical views, he did consider himself English, and the pamphlet's author simply identified as, quote, an Englishman. He did not, as it is sometimes believed, invent the term common sense, which had been in use in his native land, and that being England at the time. That term common sense had been in use in his native land long before Paine's day. In the original 14th century, meaning of the term common sense, it was considered a sense like any other sense. It was an internal feeling that was regarded as the common bond that unified all the other human senses, the five wits as they were known, and was something akin to what we now call heart. By the 16th century, the meaning had changed to be more like our present-day meaning, that is, the plain wisdom that everyone possesses. The one thing that is usually said about common sense is that it isn't as common as it ought to be. This little gag was made as early as 1726 by the political writer Nicholas Amherst in his satirical text, The Secret History of the University of Oxford. And this site goes on, by the time Paine began writing in the 1770s, the term common sense had migrated and was then widely used to mean primary truth. That is, the unquestionable beliefs that all people receive from their experience of being alive. When the authors of the U.S. Declaration of Independence began with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," their meaning was, we believe this declaration to be common sense. So there you have it, the meaning and origin of the often used phrase common sense. If you would like to learn more about the origins, I will have all of the references I used. They'll be available to you in the show notes. I thank you for having the common sense, the good sense, to stick with us here for this episode. If you have comments you would like to share, do email me at cartermethod@gmail.com. If you have not yet subscribed or you're not following this podcast, I encourage you to do that where you get your podcasts. That way you will never miss an episode. Until our next visit together, may common sense guide you every day in every way. And this is your host, Stephen Carter, wishing you and your loved ones blessings in abundance.